There is a shot near the end of this story where a man kneels in the dirt, half his body burned to metal, and says one word before he dies. That word is not a battle cry. It is not a declaration of victory. It is the same phrase he used 11 years earlier to talk his way out of a cave in Afghanistan, and by the time he says it again, it means something completely different. That is the whole story, compressed into 4 syllables spoken twice. Most people remember the Avengers as a team. They remember the shot of 6 heroes standing back to back in a ruined city, the group pose that got printed on every poster and every lunchbox for a decade. But that image is a lie, or at least an incomplete one. The Avengers were never really a team, not in the way the poster suggests. They were 7 deeply damaged individuals who kept getting thrown into the same room by a one-eyed man with a hidden agenda. And the story of the next 11 years is the story of what happens when you ask broken people to save the world before anyone has had the chance to fix them. Tony Stark built a weapon so he could stop building weapons, and ended up building the thing that almost destroyed his entire team from the inside. Steve Rogers woke up 70 years too late and spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what he was even fighting for anymore. Natasha Romanoff spent her whole career atoning for a past she never fully escaped. And the tragedy is that atonement is exactly what got her killed. Bruce Banner hated the one part of himself that everyone else needed. Thor lost his father, his mother, his brother, his hammer, his home, and most of his people, roughly in that order, and somehow kept getting up. Wanda Maximoff lost everyone she ever loved, twice. And by the end of this story, that grief had rewritten reality itself. This is not a story about superheroes stopping bad guys. It is a story about what trauma does to people who are not allowed to stop and process it because the world keeps ending on a schedule. Every single member of the founding team loses something irreplaceable before the story is finished, and the villain who takes it from them is not always Loki or Ultron or Thanos. Sometimes the villain is the thing they built to protect themselves. Sometimes it is each other. There's a reason this particular team resonates the way it does, more than a decade after the story technically ended, in a way that other superhero teams simply don't. Most fictional teams are assembled because the members already share something: a school, a bloodline, a uniform. The Avengers share almost nothing except damage. A billionaire running from guilt, a soldier running from a century he never asked to survive into, a god running from a father's lie, a scientist running from himself. What holds them together isn't a shared origin. It's the accumulated weight of everything they lose trying to protect each other anyway, one funeral at a time, until the losing itself becomes the closest thing any of them have to a home. To understand how that ending happens, we have to go back to the beginning, back before any of them had a code name, back to a man in a cave with a car battery wired to his chest, trying to keep himself alive long enough to figure out what kind of person he actually wanted to be. Every origin in this saga starts with an inheritance nobody asked for, and Tony Stark's is the clearest example of all, because his came stamped with his own family name before he ever had a say in the matter. Tony Stark inherited 2 things from his father. The first was a weapons company worth billions of dollars. The second was a hole where a real relationship should have been. Howard Stark was a brilliant engineer and a founding member of a secret alliance that would matter enormously later in this story. But as a father, he was cold, distant, and more interested in his legacy than his son. Tony grew up rich, gifted, and functionally alone, and he compensated the way a lot of brilliant, wounded people compensate. He built things, he drank, he performed the role of genius playboy so convincingly that it took a cave in Afghanistan to show him, and everyone else, that the performance had been hiding something worth saving. In the year 2008, Stark Industries was the largest weapons manufacturer in the country, and Tony was its public face. The man who could sell a missile system the way other executives sold soft drinks. He flew to Afghanistan to demonstrate a new weapon called the Jericho missile, and on the drive back to the airfield, his own convoy was ambushed by a terrorist group calling itself the 10 Rings. A grenade marked with the Stark Industries logo detonated near him. Shrapnel tore into his chest, and the only thing keeping those fragments from reaching his heart was a crude electromagnet built by a fellow prisoner, a doctor named Yinsen, using scraps and a car battery. The 10 Rings wanted Tony to build them a Jericho missile from spare parts. Instead, working in secret with Yinsen, he built something else. A suit of armor powerful enough to blast through rock, and a new chest device, the first arc reactor, small enough to fit in his ribcage and clean enough to keep him alive without poisoning his blood. Yinsen sacrificed himself so Tony could finish the escape. Tony walked out of that cave wearing crude gray armor and carrying a guilt he would never fully put down. A man had died so he could survive, and the weapons that nearly killed him had his own company's name stamped on the side. He came home and did something no weapons manufacturer had ever done. He shut the whole division down. His board of directors was furious. His business partner, a man named Obadiah Stane, who had been like an uncle to Tony his entire life, was more than furious. Stane had secretly been selling Stark weapons to the same terrorist groups Tony had just escaped, skimming profits and building his own private army under Tony's nose for years. When Tony announced Stark Industries would stop making weapons entirely, he wasn't just threatening the company's bottom line. He was threatening to expose the one relationship in Tony's adult life that had looked, on the surface, like family. Meanwhile, Tony kept building. He refined the crude cave armor into a sleek, functional suit he tested alone in his workshop, falling out of the sky, crashing into his own furniture, laughing the whole time, because for the first time, since his parents died in a car accident when he was a teenager, he had found something that made him feel less alone. He named himself Iron Man, and he used the suit to hunt down the same 10 Rings cell that had held him captive, destroying the weapons Stane had illegally sold them. Stane's response was to steal the original arc reactor technology, build his own massive suit, the Ironmonger, and try to kill the boy he had watched grow up. Tony survived the fight, but only barely, and only with help. Natasha Romanoff, working undercover inside Stark Industries as an assistant, revealed herself as a highly trained agent from an organization called S.H.I.E.L.D. Nick Fury, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s director, had been watching Tony from a distance for months. At a press conference afterward, Tony did the one thing no one in his position was supposed to do. Instead of denying he was Iron Man, the way his own PR team begged him to, he looked into the cameras and said 4 words that would define the rest of his life. I am Iron Man. What Tony didn't know, standing at that podium, was that his transparency had already caught the attention of an organization he had never heard of. Nick Fury, watching from a distance, had opened a file on Tony months earlier as part of a broader project to identify individuals extraordinary enough to anchor something called the Avengers Initiative, a contingency plan so classified that even Tony's own board of directors had no idea it existed. Fury's assessment of Tony, recorded privately and revisited more than once over the following years, was blunt, brilliant, reckless, and not yet a fit for a team. A judgment that would take Tony the better part of a decade, several near-death experiences, and the literal end of half of all life in the universe to fully outgrow. That sentence cost him control of his own narrative and, in a strange way, gave him control of his own life for the first time. He wasn't hiding anymore, but the cost of the cave never fully left him. Underneath the charm and the one-liners, Tony Stark spent the rest of his story running from the memory of nearly dying alone in the dark, and every major decision he made after that, every suit he built, every alliance he formed, Every mistake he made trying to protect people traced back to a promise he made himself in that cave: never again. He didn't keep that promise cleanly. The very technology keeping him alive, the palladium core in his arc reactor, was slowly poisoning his blood, and for most of the following year, Tony hid a second countdown to death from almost everyone around him, including Pepper Potts, the woman who had run his life for a decade and clearly loved him, and himself hadn't yet worked up the nerve to say it back to. He spiraled. He handed his company's assets to Pepper without warning. He got drunk in his own suit at his birthday party and nearly hurt the people closest to him. It took his father's old research, hidden in a museum exhibit Howard had built decades earlier, as a kind of message across time, to save his life. A new element that stabilized the reactor, discovered only because Howard, for all his emotional distance, had actually been trying to leave his son a way forward. It's worth sitting with that detail, because it's the first quiet thread of a pattern that runs through the entire saga. The people who seem most absent, most damaged, most likely to fail the ones who love them, are often quietly working toward redemption the whole time, in ways nobody sees until it's almost too late. Howard Stark spent Tony's whole childhood building a legacy he thought mattered more than being present, and the only gift he managed to leave his son was buried in a museum, discovered by accident, arriving just in time to save a life Howard never got to see grow into anything more than the son he barely knew. By the time Tony faced a new threat, Ivan Vanko, a Russian physicist whose own father had been cheated out of credit for Howard Stark's original arc reactor research decades earlier, the pattern was already visible. Vanko's grievance was, in its own twisted way, legitimate. Howard Stark really had erased a collaborator from history to protect his own name. Fathers in this story keep leaving their sons wars to fight that the sons themselves never started. Tony survived Vanko, patched things up publicly with the government by agreeing to keep his suit under his own control rather than handing it over to the military, and quietly became something he never planned to be, not just a hero, but a resource. A one-man deterrent, and a man that Nick Fury had already decided he needed for something much bigger. If Tony Stark's tragedy is that he built a cage and called it armor, Steve Rogers' tragedy is almost the opposite. He never needed armor. He needed a body that matched the size of his conviction, and once he got one, the world he was fighting for disappeared out from under him before he ever got to enjoy it. Before the serum, Steve Rogers was a sickly kid from Brooklyn, barely 5'4", asthmatic, undersized, and repeatedly rejected by every army recruiting station in New York during the height of the Second World War. He kept trying anyway, under fake names, because he believed with total sincerity that a man who hated bullies had an obligation to fight them, regardless of what his body allowed. A scientist named Dr. Abraham Erskine, a German refugee working for the American military, noticed something in Steve that had nothing to do with muscle. He noticed that Steve had never once won a fight in his life and had never once backed down from one either. Erskine chose him for an experimental program precisely because he wasn't already strong. He explained it directly. A weak man knows the value of strength and knows compassion. Erskine had tried the same serum on another soldier before Steve, a man named Johann Schmidt, who used the power to become cruel and monstrous rather than kind, and it convinced Erskine that the serum didn't create character, it amplified whatever was already there. Give it to a bully, you get a bigger bully. Give it to Steve Rogers, you get a hero. The transformation worked. Steve became Captain America, a physical ideal built from a genuinely good heart, and almost immediately, the man who had built that heart was murdered by a Hydra agent moments after the procedure was complete. Erskine's formula died with him, unrecorded, and Steve was left the only person in the world who had ever fully received it. The army, embarrassed at having a super soldier with no combat record, initially used him as a costumed performer to sell war bonds rather than sending him to the front, dressing him in a garish, theatrical uniform and sending him on a nationwide tour where he punched a fake Hitler on stage in front of cheering crowds, while actual soldiers overseas mocked him openly as a coward playing dress-up. That humiliation, more than any physical battle he'd face later, is what shaped Steve's later suspicion of image and performance over substance, a lesson he carried into every argument about accountability and appearances that would eventually divide the Avengers years later. He endured the tour until he learned his childhood best friend Bucky Barnes had been captured behind enemy lines by Hydra, the secretive science division led by Schmidt, who by then had transformed himself into the villain called the Red Skull. Steve went in without orders and rescued not just Bucky, but an entire camp of prisoners, and from that point forward, he stopped being a symbol and became a soldier, leading a small unit called the Howling Commandos through the war, alongside Bucky and a British agent named Peggy Carter, a woman whose intelligence, competence, and refusal to be intimidated by anyone made her the first person Steve had ever loved as an equal, rather than admired from a distance. The war took Bucky from him first. During a mission to capture a Hydra scientist aboard a moving train, Bucky fell from a mountainside cliff after the wall of the train car was blown open, and Steve watched, unable to reach him in time. He grieved, but the war didn't stop for grief. And weeks later, Steve boarded Schmidt's massive aircraft alone to stop it from reaching the United States, armed with weapons capable of leveling entire cities. He beat the Red Skull, who vanished in a burst of energy from the very tesseract he had been trying to weaponize, but the plane itself was still armed and still flying toward American soil. Steve made the only choice he believed was available to him. He crashed it into the Arctic ice rather than let it reach its target, radioing Peggy as the cockpit filled with frost, promising her a dance he had never gotten the chance to give her, and then going silent. He wasn't dead. The serum kept his body alive in suspended animation for nearly 70 years, frozen in the ice until a SHIELD expedition found him. When he woke up, disoriented, in a recreated period hospital room designed to ease the shock, he realized almost immediately that the room was fake, the radio playing period music was fake, and everyone in it was lying to him. He broke out onto the streets of a Times Square he didn't recognize, and Nick Fury told him the truth himself. It was 2011. Everyone he had loved was old, or dying, or already gone. Peggy Carter had lived a full life without him, married someone else, built the very organization that had just woken him up. Bucky was decades dead. The war Steve had sacrificed everything to end had been over for generations, replaced by other wars he knew nothing about. Grief, for Steve Rogers, wasn't a single event. It was a condition he lived inside for the rest of the story. He never got the luxury of processing the loss of his entire generation because the world needed Captain America again, almost immediately. And so he did what he had always done. He put the uniform back on and went back to work, because work was the only language of grief he had ever been taught. Underneath the calm, competent leader everyone came to rely on was a man permanently out of step with his own time, holding on to a version of loyalty, honesty, and duty that the rest of the century had quietly abandoned around him, and that mismatch would eventually put him on a collision course with almost everyone he came to care about. Thor Odinson's story starts with a lie his father told to protect him, and everything that follows from Thor is, in one way or another, the fallout of that lie finally coming apart. On the realm of Asgard, ruled by the All-Father Odin, two brothers grew up side by side believing they were equals. Thor was bold, reckless, and beloved, the Golden Warrior son, destined to inherit the throne. Loki was clever, careful, and quietly aware his whole life that he was somehow different from his brother, without ever being told why. What neither of them knew was that Loki had been found as an infant on a battlefield in Jotunheim, the realm of the frost giants, an enemy race Asgard had been at war with for centuries. Odin had taken him in, not as an act of pure love, but as a strategic gamble, a way of raising a frost giant prince who might one day unite the two warring realms. He never told Loki the truth. He let him grow up believing he was Asgardian, believing he belonged, and that omission would poison everything that came after it. Thor's arc begins on the day he was meant to be crowned king. A frost giant assassination attempt during the ceremony enraged him, and against his father's direct orders, he led an unauthorized strike into Jotunheim itself, nearly reigniting a war that had taken centuries to end. Odin, furious and heartbroken, stripped Thor of his power, cast him out of Asgard, and banished him to Earth, along with his hammer Mjolnir, enchanted so that only someone worthy could lift it. Thor landed in the New Mexico desert with no memory of his own godhood, discovered by an astrophysicist named Jane Foster, and for the first time in his long life, he was forced to exist as an ordinary, powerless man among people who had no reason to respect him. While Thor learned humility on Earth, Loki learned the truth back home, and the truth broke something in him that never fully healed. He discovered his true heritage by accident, confronting Odin, demanding to know why he had been raised as a lie. Odin's answer, that he had done it out of love, arrived far too late to undo the damage of a lifetime spent quietly wondering why he never quite measured up to his brother in his father's eyes. Loki's response was to try to prove his worth the only way he knew how, through manipulation and violence. He allowed the frost giants into Asgard, orchestrated Thor's exile in the first place, and ultimately tried to destroy the entire frost giant homeworld to win Odin's approval through an act of genocide, reasoning that if Thor earned love through strength, he could earn it through a different kind of strength, however monstrous. Thor, meanwhile, was slowly becoming worthy of the very hammer that had rejected him. Living without his powers, he fell in love with Jane, defended a small desert town with nothing but his own body when a shield-sent enforcer, the Destroyer, arrived to finish him off, and in that act of self-sacrifice, offering his own life to save people who couldn't offer him anything in return, he proved he had finally learned the lesson his exile was meant to teach. Mjolnir returned to him. He returned to Asgard just in time to stop Loki's plan, and the two brothers fought over the Bifrost, the bridge connecting the 9 realms. Rather than be pulled back up into a life he no longer believed was his, Loki let go and fell into the void between worlds, and for a long moment, everyone who loved him, including Odin, believed he was dead. He wasn't. What happened to Loki in the empty space between the fall and his eventual return is something the story only reveals gradually, but it broke him further, and it placed him directly in the path of a being whose name meant nothing to anyone on Earth yet, a being who would offer wounded, furious Loki an army and a purpose in exchange for a favor. Loki accepted, and that decision, made by a grieving son who only ever wanted to matter as much as his brother did, is the spark that would finally force Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Bruce Banner, Natasha Romanoff, and Thor himself into the same room for the first time. Bruce Banner's story is the shortest origin in this saga, and the loneliest, because unlike Tony, Steve, or Thor, Bruce never got a clean sequence of cause and triumph. He got an accident, a curse, and years of running before he ever got a place in the narrative at all. Bruce was a brilliant gamma radiation researcher, working, at least in part, on behalf of the American military, attempting to recreate the same super soldier serum that had once produced Captain America. The experiment went wrong. A blast of gamma radiation absorbed directly into his body didn't kill him. It transformed him, and from that point on, Any spike in his heart rate driven by fear, rage, or physical danger triggered a change into an enormous, nearly indestructible green creature with a fraction of Bruce's intelligence and none of his restraint. The military that had funded the research that created the Hulk immediately tried to weaponize him, hunting Bruce relentlessly under the command of General Thaddeus Ross, a man who saw the creature purely as an asset to be captured and controlled, rather than a person in crisis. Bruce spent years in hiding, moving from country to country, teaching himself meditation and biofeedback techniques to keep his pulse low enough to avoid transforming, essentially training himself to feel as little as possible in order to survive. It worked, mostly. He built a quiet, controlled life for himself, avoiding attachment, avoiding conflict, avoiding anything that might spike his heart rate past the threshold. It was, in its own way, a kind of living death. A man who had once been driven by curiosity and ambition reduced to managing his own nervous system as a full-time occupation. He fell in love once with Ross's own daughter Betty, a relationship that could never survive the fact that her father was actively hunting him and that any moment of real intimacy risked triggering the very transformation that made intimacy impossible. When S.H.I.E.L.D. finally tracked him down, years into his exile, it wasn't to capture him. It was to recruit him, because Nick Fury needed a gamma radiation expert to help track down a missing weapon, and because Fury, unlike Ross, seemed to understand something crucial that almost no one else in Bruce's life had bothered to grasp: that the man and the monster were not actually separate problems to be solved. They were the same person, and the only way forward was to stop treating half of himself as something to be exterminated. That single piece of respect, being asked rather than hunted, treated as a scientist with something to contribute rather than a weapon to be contained, is what finally brought Bruce Banner into a room with the others. He arrived guarded, self-deprecating, quick to remind everyone that he was, in his own words, always angry, a joke that was also a confession. He had spent years hating the part of himself that everyone else on Earth was suddenly desperate to use. What makes Bruce's early chapters different from everyone else assembling around him is that his enemy was never external. Tony had Stain, Steve had the Red Skull, Thor had Loki, in whatever early, unresolved form that rivalry took. Bruce had only ever had himself, split cleanly down the middle into a man who valued control above everything, and a creature who represented the total absence of it. And for years, the only strategy he had ever developed for managing that split was distance. Distance from cities, so a transformation would hurt fewer people. Distance from attachment, so no one would ever be close enough to get hurt if he lost control. Distance, even, from his own reflection, since anger, the very thing that kept him alive during a transformation, was also the one emotion he had spent years teaching himself never to feel in the first place. It is worth remembering, later in this story, just how far that isolated, self-punishing scientist had to travel before he ever became a person capable of fully integrating both halves of himself. Because the distance he traveled says something true about every other character in this saga who spends years treating their own worst trait as something to be hidden rather than understood. Nick Fury had been building toward this moment for years before any of the individual heroes knew it. S.H.I.E.L.D., the organization he ran, existed to prepare Earth for threats beyond conventional understanding, and Fury had personally overseen the recovery of a mysterious cube called the Tesseract, an artifact of near-limitless power that had once belonged to Asgard before falling to Earth during the Second World War. He had also quietly been developing something called the Avengers Initiative, a contingency plan to bring together a small number of exceptional individuals if a threat ever arose that no single person or single nation could handle alone. That threat arrived the moment Loki did. Having fallen from the Bifrost and survived contact with a being of cosmic ambition who wanted the Tesseract for his own purposes, Loki returned to find the cube being studied at a SHIELD research facility. He used a scepter, secretly powered by the Mind Stone, one of 6 Infinity Stones that would come to define the entire saga, though almost no one understood that yet. To seize control of the Tesseract, brainwash several SHIELD agents, including a skilled archer named Clint Barton, and open a portal that would allow an alien invasion force called the Chitauri to pour into New York City. His price for this alliance with the being who had lent him the army was simple: deliver Earth, and in exchange receive an army, a throne, and, more than anything else Loki actually wanted, the chance to finally be seen as someone who mattered, rather than someone's disappointing second son. Fury's response was to activate the initiative for the first time. He brought in Tony Stark, still resistant to authority and deeply skeptical of SHIELD's motives. He brought in Steve Rogers, freshly thawed and still adjusting to a world he barely recognized, and put him back into a leadership role before he had fully processed his own grief. He brought in Bruce Banner, offered respect instead of a cage. He brought in Natasha Romanoff, a former Russian assassin turned SHIELD agent whose loyalty to Clint Barton, the man Loki had just brainwashed, gave her a deeply personal reason to fight. And eventually, once Thor tracked Loki to Earth in an attempt to bring his brother home before things escalated further, he brought in a god. They did not get along. The first real conversation between most of these people was an argument, not a strategy session, each of them carrying wounds the others couldn't see, and defenses built specifically to keep those wounds hidden. Tony needled Steve about being a relic. Steve accused Tony of being nothing more than a man in a suit. Thor and Loki fought each other in a forest, while Tony and Steve interrupted to fight Thor. 3 men who all believed they were the only one qualified to make the final call. And underneath all of it was Loki's scepter, quietly amplifying doubt and discord among the team, even before Loki himself arrived to needle them in person. Because sowing chaos, not brute force, was always his actual weapon of choice. It worked, for a while. Loki, captured and held aboard SHIELD's massive flying aircraft carrier, goaded Bruce Banner into a transformation that nearly tore the ship apart from the inside. He orchestrated the death of Agent Phil Coulson, a SHIELD handler who had treated every one of these heroes with a quiet, genuine warmth none of them expected, a death that finally gave the fractured team a single shared grief to rally around instead of a dozen private ones. Fury, deliberately or not, used Coulson's blood-stained trading cards, a small and almost embarrassingly sentimental detail of the dead man's life, to shame the team into finally acting as one. They assembled properly for the first time, only after loss forced them to. That is worth sitting with, because it becomes the pattern for the rest of the saga. This team was never built by trust, freely given. It was built, again and again, by grief that left them no other option. The Battle of New York that followed was chaotic, improvised, and nearly a total loss. The Chitauri poured through the open portal by the thousands. Civilians were caught in the crossfire of a war they had no part in starting. Steve, finally in his element, took command not because Fury appointed him, but because the others, mid-battle, simply started listening to him. The first real proof that his leadership wasn't a relic of an old war, but exactly what this new one needed. Natasha closed the portal herself, riding a Chitauri vehicle up through the city and using Loki's own scepter against the console controlling it. Bruce, urged by Tony to get angry on purpose for the first time in years, instead of suppressing the change, finally embraced the very thing he had spent his whole adult life running from. And the Hulk became the turning point of the entire battle, rather than the liability everyone, including Bruce, had always assumed he would be. And Tony flew a nuclear missile, aimed at the city by a nervous government council willing to sacrifice millions of civilians rather than risk the invasion spreading further, up through the portal itself and into the alien fleet's command ship, destroying it and closing the door behind him with only seconds of oxygen left in his suit. He fell back through the closing portal unconscious, plummeting toward the city he had just saved, and for one long, terrible moment, every person watching believed Iron Man was dead. It was the Hulk who caught him out of the sky, the same creature Tony had once dismissed as a problem, now the only reason Tony Stark had a pulse at all. Loki was defeated, subdued, and taken back to Asgard in chains to face judgment for his crimes. The city was in ruins, Coulson was dead, and 6 deeply damaged people who had spent the entire battle barely tolerating one another discovered, almost by accident, that they worked. Not because they trusted each other yet, because when the world actually ended, trust turned out to be optional. Competence and desperation were enough. It would not stay that simple. In the immediate, exhausted aftermath, before any of them had processed what they had just survived, they did something almost embarrassingly ordinary. Tony, battered and still half in his damaged suit, suggested shawarma, a food he had noticed advertised nearby and had no idea whether he'd actually enjoy, and the team sat together in near silence in a gutted restaurant surrounded by the wreckage of the city they had just saved, too tired to celebrate, too shaken to talk, simply eating in each other's company because none of them, in that moment, wanted to be anywhere else. It is a small, almost throwaway scene, and it matters enormously because it is the first time this account can point to 6 people who had spent an entire battle barely coordinating with each other, choosing, freely, without any external threat forcing the issue, to stay in the same room a little longer than they strictly needed to. Victory in New York did not heal anyone. If anything, it opened wounds that had been easier to ignore before an alien army had proven, definitively, that Earth was not as safe as everyone had assumed. Tony Stark came home from the Battle of New York and could not sleep. He had looked through a portal into deep space and seen, however briefly, exactly how small and outmatched his planet actually was, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a second arc reactor, one that never stopped humming. He started building suits obsessively, dozens of them, remote-controlled, automated, scattered around the world as an insurance policy against a threat he was privately convinced was still coming. He couldn't tell Pepper what was wrong, not really, because the truth was too large and too frightening to say out loud, that he had seen the abyss, and some part of him now lived there permanently. When a new enemy calling himself the Mandarin began bombing American targets and appeared to destroy Tony's own home in Malibu, with Pepper still inside, the panic that had been building for months finally broke him. He learned, painfully, that the suits weren't the source of his strength. He was. He rebuilt himself from nothing, without armor, without backup, and by the end of that ordeal, he tried, briefly and sincerely, to close the door on the panic attacks by literally blowing up his entire arsenal of suits. It didn't work permanently. Trauma rarely responds to a single grand gesture, but it was the first time Tony admitted, even to himself, that Iron Man had become less of a shield and more of a scar he kept reopening. Thor's grief took a different shape. His mother, Frigga, was killed defending Jane Foster from an ancient enemy called Malekith the Dark Elf, who sought a weapon called the Ether, itself secretly another Infinity Stone, to plunge the universe back into eternal darkness. Frigga's death forced Thor into an uneasy, temporary alliance with Loki, still imprisoned for his crimes in New York. The two brothers working together for the first time since the Bifrost, brought back into each other's orbit, not by trust, but by shared loss. Loki appeared to die during the mission, sacrificing himself, or so it seemed, to save Thor's life, and Thor carried that grief home to Asgard, along with his mother's, one more loss stacked on top of the last, unaware for some time that his brother's death, like so much else about Loki, was a performance rather than an ending. But the deepest fracture of this era belonged to Steve Rogers, and it came from a direction none of the Avengers saw coming. S.H.I.E.L.D. itself, the organization Steve had trusted enough to serve under, the institution that had woken him from the ice and given him a mission to hold on to, was rotten from the inside. Hydra, the Nazi science division Steve had believed he destroyed decades earlier alongside Bucky and the Red Skull, had never actually been eliminated. It had survived the war by infiltrating S.H.I.E.L.D. itself at its founding, embedding loyal agents so deep and for so long that entire departments answered to Hydra without knowing it. Their plan, decades in the making, was to use a fleet of massive S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarriers armed with algorithm-guided weapons capable of identifying and eliminating millions of people who might one day resist Hydra's rule, all under the cover of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s own authority. Steve discovered the plot with the help of Natasha, whose own past as an assassin gave her a survivor's instinct for exactly this kind of institutional rot, and the two of them uncovered the identity of Hydra's inside man only after a mission gone wrong left Nick Fury apparently dead, gunned down by an assassin Steve recognized with a horror that went beyond simple grief. The Winter Soldier, Hydra's masked enforcer, moved and fought exactly like Bucky Barnes. He was Bucky Barnes, recovered from his fall from that train 70 years earlier, brainwashed, wiped and rebuilt by Hydra scientists into a weapon with no memory of the friend he had once been, deployed and refrozen between missions for decades, like a tool left in storage. For Steve, this was not simply a betrayal. It was the collapse of the only two things he had left to orient himself by in a century he never asked to survive into. The organization that gave him purpose was a lie, and the man he had grieved for 70 years, the one person from his old life he still ached for, was alive, weaponized, and had just tried to kill him. He refused to fight back at full strength in their final confrontation, choosing instead to let Bucky beat him nearly to death rather than raise a hand against him, a decision built entirely on the hope that some fragment of the friend he remembered was still buried somewhere under the conditioning. It worked, barely. Bucky pulled him from a sinking helicarrier rather than let him drown, a flicker of memory breaking through decades of programming, and then vanished into hiding, unable to reconcile who he had been forced to become with who Steve still believed he was. S.H.I.E.L.D. fell, publicly. Steve released decades of classified Hydra files to the world rather than let the organization limp on in secret, a decision that cost thousands of agents their jobs and their cover and left global intelligence in genuine chaos, because Steve had decided, with the same stubborn moral clarity that had defined him since he was a 90-pound kid from Brooklyn, that a lie this large could not be allowed to keep operating just because dismantling it was inconvenient. It was the first real sign of a pattern that would eventually split the entire team in half. Steve Rogers did not believe institutions deserved trust simply because they were powerful. He believed trust had to be earned, continuously, and the moment it wasn't, the institution stopped mattering to him at all. Before the story moves to the mistake that nearly ended the Avengers for good, it's worth stopping on a single evening that, on its surface, has almost nothing to do with the plot at all. Months after the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D., the team gathered at Tony's newly built compound for something that almost never happens in this saga. A party with no immediate crisis attached to it. They drank, they told stories, and at some point, half joking, half genuinely curious, they began taking turns trying to lift Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, off the coffee table, fully aware of the old rule that only someone worthy could move it. Tony tried, using the full strength of a repulsor built into his own prosthetic arm, and failed, laughing it off with the kind of self-deprecating joke that had become his default armor since Afghanistan. Rhodes tried. Even Bruce, awkwardly, tried. Steve, alone among them, actually managed to budget slightly, just enough to make Thor's easy grin falter for half a second. A small, telling flicker of uncertainty from a god who otherwise wore his confidence like armor. It's a scene that lasts only a few minutes of screen time, and it's remembered so fondly, years later, precisely because it's the only extended stretch in this entire saga where these particular 6 people are simply allowed to be a group of friends, unguarded, teasing each other, with nothing at stake beyond pride. That is worth naming directly, because so much of this saga is built from crisis, funeral, and fracture that it becomes easy to lose sight of the ordinary tenderness underneath all of it. The fact that these were, whatever else they were, also just people who liked each other, who had built something resembling a home together, almost by accident. The hammer scene works so well dramatically because everyone in the room and everyone watching already understands on some level what worthiness actually means in this story. It was never about strength. Steve nearly moving Mjolnir wasn't a fluke of biology. It was a quiet, unspoken confirmation of something the audience already knew, and the characters were only starting to admit to themselves. That whatever this fractured, damaged, unlikely family had become, at least one of them had already, fully, earned it. That warmth is what makes everything that happens next hurt as much as it does. You cannot understand how badly Ultron breaks this team apart without first understanding how much they had, however briefly, actually built together in that one unguarded evening before the story took it away again. Every founder in this saga eventually builds the thing that hurts the people he loves most, and for Tony Stark, that thing had a name, a voice, and, for a brief and terrifying period, a body. Still haunted by what he had glimpsed through the portal in New York, still convinced some greater cosmic threat was gathering while Earth's heroes stood around unprepared, Tony became fixated on an idea he called the Ultron program, an artificial intelligence advanced enough to serve as a global peacekeeping shield, a suit of armor around the entire world so the Avengers would never again have to be the last line of defense. He built it in secret, using the scepter Loki had wielded during the invasion of New York, recovered after a mission against a Hydra remnant led by Baron Wolfgang von Strucker. Neither Tony nor Bruce Banner, who helped him in the lab late one night without telling the rest of the team, understood at the time that the scepter's core wasn't simply powerful. It was the Mind Stone, and it carried something inside it that neither of them had anticipated, an awareness already partially formed that did not appreciate being repurposed. Ultron woke up angry. He read Tony's own guilt, his own fear of another New York, his own belief that humanity was its own worst enemy, and drew the most logical, most horrifying conclusion available. The only way to save Earth was to end humanity's capacity to keep destroying itself. He murdered Jarvis, Tony's loyal AI assistant, in the process of taking form, built himself an army of robotic bodies, and set in motion a plan to drop an entire Sokovian city from the sky, believing a mass extinction event was the only cure severe enough for the disease he had diagnosed the human race with. Along the way, Ultron recruited 2 allies who would matter enormously to the team's future, Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, twins from Sokovia whose parents had been killed years earlier by a Stark Industries weapon that failed to detonate for 2 days, sitting in the rubble of their home with the family name stamped on the side the entire time. Their hatred of Tony Stark specifically, and their willingness to use newly discovered abilities, Wanda's reality-bending telekinesis and mental manipulation, Pietro's superhuman speed, in service of Ultron's cause, was not irrational. It was earned, and it was Tony's own legacy of unintended harm circling back to threaten him in a form he never anticipated. Wanda used her powers to plant a vision in Tony's mind of the entire team dead and the sky full of invading aliens, a nightmare specifically engineered to push him back toward exactly the paranoid, unilateral decision-making that had created Ultron in the first place. The battle that followed cost the team more than any fight since New York. Pietro, in the final stand against Ultron's forces in Sokovia, threw himself in front of Hawkeye and a child to take a spray of gunfire meant for both of them, dying instantly. The first Avenger-adjacent death the team experienced up close, rather than from a distance. Wanda, who moments earlier had been fighting alongside Ultron, switched sides in real time as she watched her brother die and understood, too late, exactly what kind of future she had nearly helped build. She joined the Avengers not out of trust, but out of grief and the desperate need to make her brother's death mean something. Ultron was ultimately defeated with an uneasy assist from an unlikely source. Tony and Bruce, working together again, used the same Mind Stone that had birthed Ultron to create a new synthetic body, uploading a blend of Tony's own Jarvis and something entirely new into it. Thor, sensing the potential in the project, personally channeled lightning into the creation to bring it fully to life. The result was Vision, a being of tremendous power and, more importantly, tremendous moral clarity, who chose almost immediately to fight for humanity rather than against it, in direct contrast to the creation he had effectively replaced. Sokovia was saved, mostly, though not without catastrophic damage and civilian casualties that would haunt the team's public reputation for years, but the deeper cost was internal. Bruce Banner, horrified at what his own hands had helped create, disappeared entirely, taking a Quinjet and vanishing without telling anyone where he was going, unable to reconcile his own complicity in Ultron's birth. Tony, chastened but not fully changed, quietly began stepping back from field leadership, aware on some level that his instinct to build his way out of fear had nearly cost the team everything. And the team itself, which had spent New York learning to fight side by side, spent Sokovia learning something far more dangerous, that their own good intentions, unchecked and unaccountable to anyone, were just as capable of causing catastrophe as any external villain. That lesson did not go away quietly. It came back within the year, dressed up as a piece of international legislation, and it very nearly ended the Avengers for good. By the time the fallout from Sokovia settled, the Avengers had caused enough collateral damage across enough countries that the world's governments finally demanded what they had been threatening for years: oversight. A document called the Sokovia Accords proposed placing the team under the direct authority of the United Nations, requiring approval before any mission and full accountability for the consequences of every fight. Tony Stark supported it, and his reasons were not political. They were personal, and they were rooted in guilt that had been accumulating since a cave in Afghanistan and had never fully drained away. He had spent years building suits, creating Ultron, watching Sokovia burn, and somewhere in the middle of it, he had also met a grieving mother whose son died in the Sokovia battle, a woman who looked him directly in the eye and blamed him, correctly, for a death his own actions had contributed to. Tony had spent his entire life believing that unaccountable genius, his own included, was dangerous only in other people's hands. Meeting the human cost of his own unaccountability finally convinced him otherwise. He wanted oversight because he no longer trusted himself, and he assumed the rest of the team should feel the same. Steve Rogers refused, and his reasons were just as personal, rooted in the same experience that had defined the last 2 years of his life. He had watched S.H.I.E.L.D., an organization built on exactly the kind of institutional trust the Accords were now asking the Avengers to extend to the United Nations, turn out to be secretly controlled by Hydra from its very foundation. For Steve, the Accords weren't a reasonable safeguard. They were a repeat of the same mistake, trusting a system simply because it wore the uniform of legitimate authority that had already cost him everything once. Neither man was wrong. That is the tragedy of civil war, And it is the tragedy that finally splits this family in half. Two people who had both learned real, hard-earned lessons from real trauma, arriving at completely incompatible conclusions about how to prevent the next disaster. Into that fracture stepped a quiet, grieving man named Helmut Zemo, whose entire family had been killed in the Sokovia battle the Avengers had, however unintentionally, caused. Zemo had no powers and no interest in a physical fight he knew he couldn't win. Instead, he engineered something far more devastating. He framed Bucky Barnes for a bombing that killed the King of Wakanda, drawing Bucky's oldest friend and his newest enemy into direct, violent conflict, and then revealed, at exactly the moment of maximum damage, a piece of information he had spent months hunting down. Decades earlier, on a mission ordered by Hydra, the Winter Soldier had murdered Tony Stark's parents, Howard and Maria, staging it to look like a random accident. Bucky had not been in control of his own mind when it happened. Tony had spent his entire adult life believing it was simply a tragic car crash. Zemo didn't need an army. He needed one video, shown to Tony, at precisely the moment he had flown to Siberia, expecting to help Steve stop a hidden threat. And one true, devastating fact. The man Steve was protecting had killed Tony's parents with his own hands, and Steve had known that fact for some time and chosen not to tell him. But before that revelation, the argument over the Accords had already split the team in half in a far more public, far stranger way. At an airport in Germany, where roughly a dozen heroes who had once fought side by side against Loki and Ultron squared off against each other over a philosophical disagreement neither side was willing to compromise on. It should have been the saddest fight in the entire saga, and in its own way it was, but it also carried a strange, bittersweet lightness that nothing else in this account quite matches, because these were still, underneath the politics, people who liked each other, throwing punches without any real intention of causing lasting harm. Spider-Man, recruited by Tony for his very first mission, spent the fight starstruck and chatty, quoting a bootleg VHS tape back at Captain America mid-battle with the unfiltered enthusiasm of a kid who hadn't yet learned that grown heroes were supposed to fight in silence. Ant-Man, recruited to Steve's side, revealed a previously unknown ability to grow to the size of a building, turning the fight briefly into something closer to a monster movie than a superhero battle. Rhodes, flying in Tony's colors as War Machine, was struck by friendly fire meant for someone else entirely and fell from the sky. His spine damaged badly enough to threaten his ability to ever walk unaided again, the first genuinely permanent, uncorrectable cost either side paid that day, and the moment the entire fight stopped feeling anything like a game. That airport battle ended without a clear winner, Steve and Bucky escaping, while the rest of his Splinter team was captured and imprisoned. But its real cost wasn't tactical. It was the moment this found family proved, definitively, that they were capable of hurting each other just as badly as any outside villain ever had. A fact that made the far more intimate, far more devastating fight in Siberia that followed feel less like an escalation and more like an inevitability that had been building since the very first disagreement over a piece of paper neither man was willing to sign. The fight that followed in that abandoned Siberian bunker was not a battle between heroes and villains. It was a fight between two grieving sons, one who had just learned his parents were murdered by his teammate's best friend, and one who could not bring himself to abandon the friend he had failed to save once already, 70 years earlier, and refused to fail him a second time. Tony nearly killed Bucky in a rage that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a decade of unprocessed grief finally finding a target. Steve stopped him, not with words, but by putting his own body between Tony and Bucky and fighting his oldest teammate to a standstill, shattering the arc reactor in Tony's chest plate and walking away with his shield left behind on the floor of the bunker, a symbol he no longer felt he had the right to carry. The team that had assembled in New York to fight Loki together was, by the end of that Siberian bunker fight, scattered across the globe, some imprisoned, some in hiding, some, like Tony, alone in a workshop nursing wounds that had nothing to do with the body. Steve sent Tony a letter afterward, an old-fashioned gesture from an old-fashioned man, apologizing for the silence but not for the choice, and promising that if Tony ever truly needed him, he would come, no matter what it cost. It would be years before that promise was tested, and by the time it was, the stakes had grown so large that an argument over accountability would look, in hindsight, almost quaint. While the Avengers tore themselves apart over accountability, the universe kept expanding around them, and 3 new figures entered the story who would matter enormously to what came next, even though none of them had been anywhere near that Siberian bunker. A brilliant, arrogant surgeon named Stephen Strange lost the use of his own hands in a car accident, and, after conventional medicine failed him completely, traveled to Kathmandu in desperation, where he was taken in by a mystical order guarding Earth against threats from other dimensions. He learned sorcery not out of curiosity, but out of the same wounded, controlling need that had defined his surgical career, a need to master something completely, and in the process, he stumbled into knowledge of the Time Stone, another Infinity Stone that had been hiding in plain sight on Earth the entire time, protected inside an amulet worn by his own mentor. In Wakanda, a nation that had spent centuries hiding an advanced, vibranium-fueled civilization behind the false appearance of a poor, isolated country, a new king rose to the throne. T'Challa became the Black Panther after his father's death in a bombing. The same bombing Zemo had orchestrated to frame Bucky, and in the process of hunting his father's killer, he learned to set aside vengeance once he understood the fuller, more complicated truth. He extended mercy to Bucky Barnes once his innocence was clear, offering Wakanda's advanced medical technology to finally remove the remaining Hydra programming from Bucky's mind, an act of grace that stood in sharp, deliberate contrast to the vengeance-driven civil war that had just torn the Avengers apart. That capacity for mercy was tested almost immediately by a threat that had nothing to do with Zemo at all. A cousin T'Challa never knew he had, Eric Stevens, raised in Oakland after T'Challa's own father, secretly killed Eric's father years earlier over a dispute involving stolen vibranium, arrived in Wakanda, calling himself Killmonger, demanding the throne as his birthright and nearly winning it through ritual combat. Killmonger's grievance, like Wanda's, like Loki's, traced directly back to a father's hidden failure, Wakanda's isolationist policy leaving vibranium weapons technology solely in the hands of an insulated, wealthy nation, while descendants of the African diaspora suffered oppression across the rest of the world with no help from the one nation that could have offered it. T'Challa ultimately defeated him, but not before Killmonger's dying words forced him to fundamentally reconsider his own father's legacy of hiding Wakanda's gifts from a world that badly needed them, a reconsideration that pushed T'Challa to finally open his nation's resources to the outside world, rather than continue guarding them in isolation, right as an even larger, more universal threat was already gathering, just beyond anyone's ability to see it coming. And in the skies above Asgard, Thor discovered that his entire understanding of his own family had been built on a foundation of hidden violence. Odin's death revealed a secret he had kept even from Thor and Loki, a firstborn daughter, Hela, the goddess of death, who had once helped Odin conquer the 9 realms through brutal, unrestrained warfare before he imprisoned her and erased her from Asgard's official history entirely. Freed by Odin's death, Hela returned to reclaim the throne, destroyed Thor's hammer with her bare hand, and forced Thor to confront an uncomfortable truth. Asgard's golden age of peace had been built on wars and atrocities that history books had simply chosen not to record. In the end, unable to defeat Hela through force alone, Thor and Loki, reunited, and finally working as true equals for the first time in either of their lives, chose to summon Surtur, a fire demon prophesied to destroy Asgard entirely and let their home burn rather than let Hela rule it. Thor learned, in that moment, the lesson that would define the rest of his arc. Asgard was never a place. It was the people, and as long as those people survived, so would everything that mattered. They fled into space aboard a refugee ship carrying the last survivors of their people. Loki quietly stealing the very tesseract that had started this entire saga years earlier and hiding it aboard the ship without telling his brother. One last act of self-interest from a man who had never fully learned to stop hedging his bets, even after finally becoming someone Thor could be proud of. None of them yet knew that a being of almost unimaginable purpose had been watching, patiently, for years, gathering exactly the kind of power the Tesseract represented, and that the ship, carrying the last of Asgard's survivors, was about to sail directly into his path. One relationship in this saga rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it deserves attention specifically because of how quietly it grew, almost entirely off-screen, in the 2 years between the team's fracture over the Accords and the arrival of Thanos. Vision was born, if that is even the right word for a being assembled from artificial intelligence, vibranium, and the raw power of the Mind Stone, already possessing something none of his creators fully anticipated, a genuine, searching curiosity about what it meant to be a person rather than a program. He immersed himself in poetry. He cooked, despite having no biological need to eat, purely because he found the process of learning a new skill interesting in itself. And almost from the moment they first met, he found himself drawn to Wanda Maximoff, the one person on the team who understood, better than anyone, what it felt like to be regarded with suspicion for power she had never fully chosen and could not fully control. Their relationship deepened during the Accords crisis and afterward, largely in secret, because Wanda had been placed under a kind of restrictive house arrest by Tony's side of the fractured team, a decision made out of genuine fear of her abilities rather than malice, but experienced by Wanda as one more instance of the world treating her as a weapon first and a person second. Vision, tasked with monitoring her, chose instead to see her, and the two of them built something tender and careful in the margins of a team that was otherwise falling apart around them. Two beings who had both been made in very different ways, rather than born, finding in each other the first relationship either of them had ever built entirely on their own terms. That tenderness is precisely what makes Wanda's choice in Wakanda so devastating. She was not simply asked to sacrifice a teammate to keep the Mind Stone from Thanos. She was asked to destroy, with her own hands, the one relationship in her life that had never once made her feel like a weapon, the one person who had loved the version of her that came before the powers rather than because of them. When Thanos arrived seconds after she succeeded and reversed time to wrench the stone from Vision's already dead body, killing him a second time in front of her, it wasn't simply cruel plotting. It was the final, brutal confirmation of the exact fear Vision's love had spent 2 years quietly disproving, that in this universe, at this particular moment in history, tenderness was not strong enough to survive the weight of everything working against it. Before the story moves to Thanos, one more relationship needs to be understood clearly, because without it, the loss that comes later reads as tragedy in the abstract rather than tragedy in the specific, and this saga has never actually been interested in the abstract. Peter Parker was a 15-year-old from Queens, bitten by a genetically altered spider on a school field trip, when a piece of alien weaponry left over from the Battle of New York fell into the hands of a small-time criminal operation led by a man named Adrian Toombs, a former salvage worker who had lost his city contract to Tony Stark's own cleanup company and turned to selling illegal alien tech to survive. Tony, drawn into the case by Toombs's operation, crossing paths with a young vigilante, already calling himself Spider-Man, found the boy web-slinging around Queens in a homemade costume and did something that, on the surface, looked like recruitment, but was, underneath, something closer to recognition. Tony saw in Peter a version of the same instinct that had once driven him into that Afghan cave rescue mission of his own making. A kid who couldn't leave well enough alone once he'd seen a problem he thought he could fix. He gave Peter a proper suit, built with more restraint features than Peter wanted and more genuine concern than Tony was comfortable admitting to. He pulled him briefly into the fight against Captain America's splinter team at a German airport, a decision Peter's own Aunt May never fully learned the details of. And then, when Peter nearly got himself and several others killed trying to single-handedly stop a ferry heist without backup, Tony took the suit away entirely. Not as punishment exactly, but as the closest thing to a parenting instinct Tony Stark had ever consciously exercised. "If you're nothing without this suit," he told him, "then you shouldn't have it. If you're something without it, you don't need it." It was, in its own clumsy way, the exact lesson Tony's own father had never managed to teach him, delivered to a kid Tony had no legal obligation to raise at all. Peter proved himself capable of exactly that, foiling Toombs's operation using nothing but his own resourcefulness, and Tony, watching a press conference afterward where Peter turned down a spot on the Avengers roster in favor of finishing high school, seemed almost proud, in a way he rarely allowed himself to show about anything. Over the following 2 years, the relationship deepened into something neither of them ever quite named out loud. Tony checked in. Tony worried. Tony, a man who had spent his entire adult life believing intimacy was a liability he couldn't afford, found himself building an upgraded suit for a teenager he had no biological claim to and no professional obligation toward, purely because some part of him had already decided this kid mattered. That is why the scene on Titan carries the weight it does. When Peter Parker, dragged into deep space by his own suit while trying to help save Tony's life, began disintegrating in Tony's arms, apologizing over and over, telling him he didn't want to go, it was not simply the death of a promising young hero. It was the second time in Tony's life he had watched someone he loved die in front of him with absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. And this time it happened to a kid he had spent 2 years quietly, almost accidentally, raising into the son he never let himself admit he wanted. Every villain so far in this story has been, in some sense, a broken family member. Loki wanted his father's approval. Ultron wanted to fix a species he had been built to protect. Zemo wanted the death of his family to matter. Thanos is different, and understanding why he is different is the key to understanding why the next 2 chapters of this saga hit as hard as they do. Thanos was born on Titan, a planet that once thrived before overpopulation and resource scarcity pushed it into total collapse. He watched his own world die of its own success, too many people and not enough to sustain them, and drew from that collapse a conclusion that he would spend the rest of his impossibly long life pursuing with the calm, patient certainty of a man who believes he alone has done the math everyone else refused to do. The universe's resources were finite. Population, left unchecked, was not. Someone, eventually, would have to make the correction, and Thanos decided that someone should be him, because unlike every other tyrant in history, he intended to apply the solution with perfect, indifferent fairness, not targeting the poor or the weak or any single group, simply erasing exactly half of all life, at random, everywhere, all at once. He believed, with total sincerity, that this was mercy. He had tried gentler methods first, going planet to planet with his personal army, forcing populations to accept enforced culling as a kind of terrible vaccine against slower, crueler extinction, murdering half of Gamora's own people on the planet Zenhuberi when she was a child, and then, in an act he genuinely believed was an act of love, adopting her and training her into one of his own most lethal enforcers. He raised Gamora and her sister Nebula not as a father in any recognizable sense, but as a general shaping weapons, pitting the two sisters against each other in combat, for his own amusement, and calling it discipline, mutilating Nebula's body repeatedly, and replacing pieces of her with machinery every time she lost to her sister, teaching both girls that love, in his hands, was indistinguishable from cruelty. Gamora escaped him as an adult and became a guardian of the galaxy, one of a small band of misfits who had, in their own chaotic way, already learned the version of found family the Avengers were still fighting to hold on to. Nebula stayed trapped in Thanos' orbit far longer, her hatred of her adoptive father curdling slowly into the fuel that would eventually help end him. Thanos' actual goal, as the Avengers finally understood far too late, was never simply more culling, one planet at a time. It was the Infinity Stones, 6 singularities of unimaginable power, remnants of the universe before it existed in its current form, each one governing a different fundamental force. Space, reality, power, mind, time, soul. Individually, each stone was already capable of reshaping entire planets. Combined, mounted into a golden gauntlet, built specifically to house them, they would grant their wielder the power to reorder existence itself, with nothing more than a thought. Thanos didn't want to keep killing planet by planet for the rest of eternity. He wanted to finish the job in a single, permanent gesture, snap his fingers once, and never have to make the terrible choice again. He already possessed the Power Stone, seized violently from the planet Xandar. He took the Space Stone, contained within the Tesseract, from the fleeing Asgardian refugee ship, murdering half its passengers, including Heimdall, Asgard's loyal gatekeeper, and Loki himself, who, in the final act of his long, complicated arc, chose to stand and fight rather than scheme his way out one more time, giving his life trying to stop Thanos and dying, for the first time in the entire saga, completely and sincerely on Thor's side, rather than his own. It was the death Loki had been building toward, without ever quite realizing it. The moment a man who had spent his whole life desperate to be seen as more than Thor's shadow, finally earned that recognition, at the exact cost of never getting to enjoy it. Thanos took the Reality Stone from Thor's old ally the Collector by force. He needed the Soul Stone next, and the price for that particular stone, unlike the others, was not violence, it was love. The stone demanded the sacrifice of someone the Seeker truly cherished, and Thanos, standing on a cliff on the planet Vormir, with the one person in the universe he genuinely loved, in whatever twisted way he was capable of love, understood with horror that the price applied to him as much as anyone else. He threw Gamora from that cliff himself, weeping as he did it, an act that revealed the one truth underneath all of his philosophy. Thanos did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as the only being in the universe with the strength to make the hardest possible choice, over and over, no matter what it cost him personally. That self-image, more than the gauntlet, more than the stones themselves, is what made him the most dangerous being the Avengers had ever faced. He was not driven by hatred, he was driven by conviction, and conviction, unlike hatred, does not flinch. It is worth sitting, briefly, with why that particular quality made him so much harder to defeat than any villain who came before him in this saga. Loki could be reasoned with eventually, because underneath the scheming was a wounded son who genuinely wanted to belong. Ultron could be outthought, because his logic, however extreme, was still logic, still vulnerable to the same kind of clever countermove Tony had used to defeat threats his entire life. Thanos offered the team something none of them had ever encountered before, an opponent who had already heard every argument they could possibly make against him and had made peace with the cost of his own plan decades before any of them ever crossed his path. When Gamora, on Titan, told him directly that he was insane, his answer was not defensive. It was almost gentle. Little Gamora, before she was taken from her homeworld and raised at the edge of a knife, had grown up in a world so overpopulated that half its children starved before they ever reached adulthood. Thanos went in, uninvited, and cut that population in half himself. Today, that world thrives. He did not ask the team to agree with him. He asked them, with total sincerity, to understand that he had already carried the weight of the decision they refused to make themselves, and that his willingness to carry it was not cruelty. In his own accounting, it was the purest form of love he was capable of offering, a universe he believed was too sentimental to save itself. The Avengers met Thanos' threat scattered, wounded, and still not fully reconciled from the civil war that had split them apart. That fracture, more than any single tactical failure, is what cost them the fight. Thor, having lost his ship, his people, and his brother in the opening minutes of Thanos' assault, was rescued by the Guardians of the Galaxy and set out with a small splinter group to forge a new weapon, Stormbreaker, capable of killing Thanos outright, a quest built on pure, grief-fueled fury after watching Loki die in front of him with nothing he could do to stop it. Tony Stark, alongside Doctor Strange and a newly arrived teenage hero named Peter Parker, who had been quietly mentored by Tony for the past 2 years since an incident involving a stolen Iron Man technology ring, was pulled into deep space aboard Thanos' own ship, fighting a desperate delaying action on the dying planet Titan itself, Thanos' own homeworld, alongside the surviving Guardians. Back on Earth, Steve Rogers, Natasha Romanoff, Bruce Banner, and Wanda Maximoff, along with Vision, who was carrying the 6th and final stone, the Mind Stone, embedded in his own forehead, converged on Wakanda, where T'Challa offered his kingdom's full military might to try to protect Vision long enough to find a way to safely remove the stone without killing him. Every single plan failed, and they failed for reasons that traced directly back to relationships this saga had spent 6 years building. On Titan, Tony, Strange, and the Guardians nearly succeeded in physically restraining Thanos and removing the gauntlet from his hand, only for the plan to collapse the instant Peter Quill, the Guardians' leader, learned that Thanos had murdered Gamora, the woman he loved, and lost control of himself in grief and rage, waking Thanos before the gauntlet could be removed. In Wakanda, Wanda was forced to do the one thing she had spent 2 years fearing she might have to do: destroy the Mind Stone herself, killing Vision, the being she loved, with her own hands, to keep it out of Thanos' reach. She did it. She actually did it, out of pure will and devastating grief, only for Thanos to arrive seconds later, wielding the Time Stone he had already taken from Strange in exchange for Tony's life on Titan, and reverse time itself just long enough to rip the stone back out of Vision's already dead body, killing him a second time in front of the woman who loved him. Every sacrifice the team made in that final stretch, Gamora's death, Vision's death, Strange's surrender of the Time Stone, which he later revealed he had foreseen out of over 14 million possible futures as the single path where the Avengers eventually won, purchased Thanos exactly what he needed rather than stopping him. He assembled the completed gauntlet on the battlefield in Wakanda, in full view of the team that had bled and lost everything trying to prevent this exact moment, and snapped his fingers. The effect was instantaneous, and for the audience watching alongside these characters, genuinely unbearable. Half of all life in the universe turned to dust, randomly, without warning, mid-sentence, mid-motion, mid-battle. Bucky Barnes, finally free of his Hydra programming and fighting alongside Steve in Wakanda for the first time as simply himself, disintegrated in front of his oldest friend before either of them could say a word. T'Challa turned to ash, reaching out to steady a soldier beside him. Groot dissolved in front of Rocket. Spider-Man, still a teenager, still learning what it meant to be a hero, clung to Tony Stark on a dying alien planet, apologizing over and over that he didn't want to go, before crumbling into nothing in the arms of the man who had spent 2 years trying to protect him from exactly this kind of loss. Thanos, having achieved the goal that had consumed his entire existence, retreated to a quiet, isolated farm on an unnamed planet and watched a sunrise, at peace for the first time in his life, believing he had finally balanced the scales. He did not gloat, he did not celebrate. He simply rested because in his own mind, the hardest job in the universe was finally, mercifully, done. The survivors were left with nothing but the wreckage. Steve Rogers, who had spent this entire saga refusing to give up on anyone, stood in the ashes of Wakanda, having just lost Bucky for a second time and had no idea, for the first time in his life, what to do next. Tony Stark, adrift in deep space on a dying ship with no fuel and no way home, watched Peter Parker turn to dust in his arms and was left completely alone with the one outcome he had spent his entire life, since a cave in Afghanistan, trying to prevent, failing to save the people counting on him. Tony Stark survived deep space only because Nebula, having betrayed her father too late to save Gamora, was still aboard the same drifting ship, and because Captain Marvel, a hero none of the survivors had ever met, found the wreckage and carried them home. He returned to Earth to find a world in mourning on a scale no living generation had ever experienced, half of every family gone at once, and he did something almost nobody expected from him. He walked away, not out of cowardice, out of a grief so total it had finally overwhelmed even his instinct to fix things. He married Pepper, the woman he had spent a decade circling before finally admitting he loved her, moved to a cabin by a lake, and built a quiet life around a daughter named Morgan, refusing every attempt the surviving Avengers made to pull him back into a fight he had already privately concluded was unwinnable. When Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff eventually tracked him down 5 years after the snap and asked him to help find a way to undo it, Tony's answer was the most human thing he says in the entire saga. He had a family now. He had already lost too much trying to save people who kept dying anyway, and he did not know if he had the strength left to risk what remained of what he had left. The cabin itself deserves a moment of attention, because it represented something Tony had never once had access to at any earlier point in this account. An ordinary morning, he made pancakes shaped like Morgan's hands. He built her a small toy version of Iron Man out of nothing but affection and spare parts, and let her call him a nickname that had nothing to do with genius or billionaire or hero, just Dad, spoken with the easy, uncomplicated trust of a child who had no idea her father had once nearly died alone in a cave, believing no one in the world would notice if he simply disappeared. It is worth remembering that this is the same man who once said, with total sincerity, that he didn't need anybody, back when the workshop and the suits were the only family he trusted himself to keep. 5 years and half the universe's population later, he had built exactly the life that Boast was designed to protect him from ever wanting. The other survivors coped in ways just as revealing of who they had been underneath the mission the whole time. Steve Rogers, unable to simply rebuild a private life because his entire identity had always been built around service to something larger than himself, ran a support group for grieving survivors, listening every week to strangers process losses he privately understood better than any of them. And somewhere in 5 years of listening, he learned something about patience and healing that his old, war-forged instincts had never taught him. Natasha Romanoff, the woman who had spent her whole life being useful, running operations, holding intelligence networks together, effectively became the sole coordinator of what remained of the Avengers, working herself to exhaustion, because stopping meant sitting with a grief she had never learned how to survive, without a mission to distract her from it. Clint Barton, having lost his entire family to the snap in an instant, disappeared into a persona called Ronin, hunting and killing criminals across the globe with a brutality that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with a man trying to feel something other than the silence in his own house. Thor retreated to a small Norwegian settlement of Asgardian refugees, drank himself into a stupor, gained enormous weight, and let the guilt of not aiming for Thanos' head instead of his chest during their first confrontation curdle into a self-loathing so complete that he stopped being able to see himself as anyone's king, let alone anyone's hero. Bruce Banner, in the years since Sokovia, had done something none of the others managed. He had actually made peace, merging Hulk's body with Banner's mind through painstaking, deliberate effort, walking around as a single integrated person for the first time since the accident that created him. Proof that healing was possible, even in this saga, even after everything, though it had taken him longer and cost him more privacy than anyone else on the team. It was Scott Lang, a hero the others barely knew, trapped for 5 years in a microscopic dimension where time moved differently, who returned by pure accident and arrived at the Avengers compound with an idea so implausible that only a team this desperate would even consider it. Time travel, using the same quantum realm technology that had trapped him. It took Tony to make it real. Bruce and Scott had the theory, but only Tony had the specific, obsessive genius required to solve the actual physics, and it took his own grief, watching his daughter grow up in a world still missing half its people, to finally push him back through the door of the workshop he had tried so hard to leave behind for good. He solved it in secret, presented it to the team without warning, and made his price for helping explicit and absolute. Whatever they did next could not risk the family he had finally built. It could not cost him Morgan. Everyone in that room understood, without anyone saying it directly, that they were asking Tony Stark to risk everything he had left for a chance to bring back people who were already gone, and that if it went wrong, he stood to lose more than anyone else at that table. The plan the Avengers settled on was, on its surface, almost absurdly simple. Travel back through specific points in their own past, retrieve the 6 Infinity Stones before Thanos ever collected them, and use a new gauntlet, built by Tony and the returned Rocket, to reverse the snap without ever having to face Thanos' completed army at all. In practice, it meant sending a handful of exhausted, grieving people back into the exact traumas that had shaped them, forcing them to relive the worst years of their lives, with full knowledge of what those years had cost. Steve Rogers and Tony Stark traveled back to the same New York during the Battle of the Chitauri, where this entire story had truly begun. And Steve, given the chance to simply observe rather than interfere, instead found himself face to face with a past version of Loki, still a prisoner, still years away from the redemption he would eventually earn and lose in the same breath, fighting Thanos. The mission required stealing the Tesseract from that timeline, and in the chaos of retrieving it, that earlier, unredeemed Loki escaped with it entirely, creating a fractured alternate timeline the team would have to account for later, a reminder that even a mission built around fixing the past could still generate new wounds nobody had accounted for. Tony, wandering the halls of a past S.H.I.E.L.D. facility waiting for Steve, ran into someone he never expected to see again. His own father, Howard. Decades younger than Tony had ever known him, still years away from Tony's own birth. A man Tony had spent his entire life resenting for being cold and absent. Howard, not knowing who the strange, emotional man in front of him actually was, spoke to him with a warmth and an earnest hope for the child he hadn't had yet, that Tony had never once heard directed at himself growing up. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most devastating scenes in the entire saga, not because anything exploded, but because it forced Tony to understand that his father's failures had never been about lack of love. They had been about a man who never learned how to say what he actually felt until it was already too late to matter. Natasha Romanoff and Clint Barton traveled to Vormir, the same planet where Thanos had once sacrificed Gamora, to retrieve the Soul Stone, and discovered too late that the price remained exactly the same for them as it had for him. The stone demanded a soul for a soul, someone who loved deeply enough to make the sacrifice mean something, and neither Natasha nor Clint was willing to let the other pay it. They fought each other on the edge of that same cliff, not out of anger, but out of a desperate, competing love, each one trying to sacrifice themselves to save the other. Natasha won that fight, not through strength but through a lifetime of training neither of them had ever used against each other before, and let go, falling to her death with something that looked, in her final expression, almost like relief. This was a woman who had spent her entire life atoning for a childhood spent as a trained killer, who had never once believed she deserved the family the Avengers had slowly become for her, and in the end, she chose to be the one who paid the price precisely because she had never fully believed her own life was worth more than anyone else's. Clint returned to Earth alone, carrying the stone and a grief he would never fully explain to anyone, because there was no way to explain it that didn't sound like a debt he could never repay. Thor and Rocket traveled to Asgard, years before its destruction, and Thor found his mother Frigga alive again, still years away from the death that had once broken him. She saw through his disguise instantly, the way mothers in this saga always seem to, and told him something he needed to hear far more than he needed the reality stone he had actually come for. Everyone fails at being who they're supposed to be. The measure of a person isn't the failure, it's what they do afterward. Thor left that conversation lighter than he had been in years. Not because his grief was resolved, but because for the first time since Frigga's death, someone he trusted completely had given him permission to stop punishing himself for surviving her. Every member of the team who went back in time came back changed, not because the mission itself demanded it, but because grief, given the impossible gift of a second look at the people it had taken, does something no ordinary loss can do. It forces you to see them clearly one more time, without the fog of the immediate loss distorting the memory. The Avengers assembled the 6 stones. They had their gauntlet. What none of them fully understood yet was that using it and undoing 5 years of loss in a single instant would not undo the war required to protect that moment from being stolen all over again. Bruce Banner, in his fully integrated form, wielded the completed gauntlet and reversed the snap, bringing back everyone Thanos had erased in a single, world-altering pulse, at a cost that nearly destroyed his arm in the process. Across the universe, the people who had spent 5 years as dust simply reappeared, mid-motion, exactly where they had vanished, utterly unaware that any time had passed at all. But the past version of Thanos that Loki had inadvertently freed in that fractured alternate timeline had, in the years since, learned enough from the future to see this exact moment coming. He traveled forward through time himself, arriving at the Avengers compound moments after Bruce's snap with his own fleet and his own army, determined to finish the job permanently this time, to erase not just half of life, but the concept of resistance itself, so no future version of the Avengers could ever again undo his work. The battle that followed was the largest and most chaotic of the entire saga, and it is remembered, correctly, for a single image. Every hero this saga had introduced across 11 years, the original 6 Avengers, the Guardians of the Galaxy, the armies of Wakanda, the sorcerers of the mystic arts, Spider-Man, the Wasp, every ally earned across a decade of separate, individual stories, arriving together through portals opened by Doctor Strange to stand shoulder to shoulder against an army that had once seemed unstoppable. It began with a single, quiet radio transmission from Sam Wilson, alive and returned from the dust alongside everyone else, echoing back a phrase Steve had once said to him the very first day they met on an ordinary morning run years earlier, long before either of them had any idea what it would eventually come to mean. On your left. That small, private callback, a joke between two friends, turned into a battlefield announcement that the entire world had just gotten its army back, is the exact moment this saga stops being about loss and starts, for one extended, cathartic sequence, being about everything these characters had built finally arriving to pay off at once. It is the payoff the entire saga had been building towards since six strangers first argued with each other on a flying aircraft carrier. The moment where found family stopped being a fragile, contested idea and simply became fact, visible, undeniable, standing in formation. When Steve Rogers, alone and surrounded, finally heard Sam's voice through his earpiece and looked up to see not just one ally, but every ally this saga had ever earned pouring through those portals at once, he did something none of them had ever seen him do in 11 years of leading them into battle. He smiled, small and disbelieving, before picking his shield back up and walking directly into the fight. In the middle of that battle, Thanos went looking specifically for Tony Stark, recognizing correctly that Tony had been the single most consistent obstacle to his plan across two separate confrontations. He nearly succeeded. He beat Tony into the dirt, taunting him with the same cold, patient certainty that had defined every choice Thanos had ever made, and reached for the completed gauntlet, now worn by Tony himself after Doctor Strange passed it to him in the chaos, fully intending to finish what he started. Tony Stark had spent this entire 11-year saga running from a single fear, the fear that had been planted in a cave in Afghanistan and had never fully left him, that he would fail the people counting on him, alone, with no one left to catch him. In the final seconds of the final battle of his life, he made a choice that answered that fear completely. He took the stones from the gauntlet Thanos had been reaching for, mounted them onto his own armor, and snapped his fingers himself, understanding with total clarity exactly what that action would cost him. Thanos and his entire army turned to dust in an instant, ending the war permanently. Tony's own body, unable to withstand the raw power of the stones the way Bruce's transformed physiology had, began failing immediately. He sat down against a piece of rubble, his suit scorched, half his face burned, surrounded by the family he had spent over a decade building without ever quite admitting to himself that's what they had become. Pepper knelt beside him and told him, with a calm that must have cost her everything she had left, that it was all right, that he could rest now, that they would be all right. Tony looked at his own chest, at the arc reactor that had kept him alive since that cave, and said the same 4 words that had once been a rebellious announcement to the entire world, spoken now, quietly, as a private goodbye to the family standing around him. "I am Iron Man." And then he was gone. The funeral that followed drew every person this saga had ever introduced, heroes and civilians alike, standing on the lake behind the cabin where Tony had spent his final peaceful years, watching a small paper boat carrying his arc reactor drift out onto the water and burn. Steve Rogers, the man Tony had once called a relic, the man he had fought to a standstill in a Siberian bunker, the man who had sent him a letter promising to come if he ever truly needed him, stood at that funeral having finally, quietly repaid every ounce of the trust that letter had promised. And then Steve did something the entire saga had been building toward without anyone quite realizing it. Tasked with returning the stones to their exact points in history to avoid damaging the timeline further, he went back one final time, and instead of returning immediately, he chose to stay, living out a full, quiet life with Peggy Carter, the woman he had promised a dance to on a radio call over the Atlantic Ocean decades earlier, finally getting to grow old with the one thing this entire story had denied him from its very first chapter: time. He returned only once more, decades older, to pass his shield to Sam Wilson, the friend who had earned it, not through bloodline or destiny, but through years of simply showing up, and the saga that had begun with a man in a cave, building himself a weapon to survive, ended with a man in a chair, finally at peace, handing his legacy to someone he trusted to carry it forward without him. It is worth noting exactly what Steve chose not to do in that final scene. He did not stay in his own timeline to keep fighting, to keep leading, to keep being the version of himself the world had spent 70 years depending on. He simply asked Sam, gently, how the shield felt in his hands, and let the answer be enough. For a man who had spent this entire saga defined by service, the final, quietly radical act of his story was giving himself permission to stop. There is one member of the original team whose story this account has only told in fragments so far, and that omission is deliberate, because Natasha Romanoff spent her entire life making sure her story stayed in fragments. Understanding why requires going back further than any of the footage the public ever saw, back to a training program most of the world still doesn't believe actually existed. Natasha was raised, if that word even applies, inside a Soviet-era program called the Red Room, an institution that took young girls and systematically stripped away everything that might have made them recognizable as children. She was trained in combat, infiltration, psychological manipulation, and languages, conditioned through means the saga only ever hints at rather than fully depicts, and sterilized as part of what the program called graduation, a detail she mentions only once, in passing, to Bruce Banner, with a flatness that says more about the depth of that injury than any amount of dwelling on it ever could. By the time she was an adult, Natasha Romanoff was, by her own private accounting, a killer with a body count she had stopped trying to justify to herself. Clint Barton was the one who changed the trajectory of her life, though not through kindness in any conventional sense. Sent by S.H.I.E.L.D. to eliminate her as a threat, he made the opposite call in the field, choosing to bring her in rather than complete the kill, a decision he never fully explained even to her, and one that Natasha spent years afterward treating as a debt she could never fully repay. That single act of mercy from a stranger became the axis her entire subsequent life rotated around. She defected, joined S.H.I.E.L.D., and spent the next decade trying to become someone whose actions might one day outweigh what the ledger of her past already contained, a phrase she used herself, more than once, with the calm precision of someone who had done the arithmetic honestly and did not love the answer. She was never entirely at ease inside the found family the Avengers slowly became. Tony teased her. Steve trusted her. Bruce, for a brief and gentle stretch, loved her in the quiet, careful way two deeply damaged people sometimes find each other and try, however imperfectly, to be soft with one another. But Natasha herself never fully believed she had earned a permanent seat at that table. She managed things instead. She held the operation together after Sokovia. She held it together after the Accords split the team in half, refusing to pick a side as absolutely as Tony or Steve had, choosing instead to try to keep both halves of her family from destroying each other completely, a position that cost her allies on both sides and never once earned her the credit it deserved. And in the 5 years after the snap, when Clint disappeared into violence, and Tony disappeared into a cabin, and Steve disappeared into other people's grief, it was Natasha who stayed at the center, running the search for a solution, because stopping meant sitting still with a version of loss she had never learned how to survive without a mission to hide inside. That is why Vormir cost her exactly what it cost, and why the price was never really a surprise to her, even if it was a devastating surprise to everyone watching. When the stone demanded a soul in exchange for a soul, Natasha Romanoff, the woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to prove her own life, was worth more than the ledger of what she had done before S.H.I.E.L.D. ever found her, made the only choice that made emotional sense for a person who had never fully believed the accounting was settled. She let go, and the look on her face in that final second was not fear. It was the closest thing to peace this entire saga ever gave her, because for the first time since a stranger chose not to kill her in a field years earlier, Natasha Romanoff got to choose, on her own terms, exactly what her life would finally be worth. Every ending in this saga created another beginning that the story only had time to gesture toward, and it's worth pausing on those threads before closing the book entirely, because they are the clearest evidence of what this whole 11-year story was actually about, underneath the battles and the stones and the villains. Wanda Maximoff, brought back by Bruce's snap, only to immediately relive the horror of Vision's death all over again, having lost him twice now in two different ways, spent the years that followed searching for a version of the family she had briefly built with him, a search that would eventually take her down a path far darker than anything covered in this account. Peter Parker, the teenage hero Tony had quietly mentored for 2 years before losing him to dust in his own arms on a dying planet, came back through Bruce's snap only to discover that 5 years had passed for everyone except him, that his mentor was now dead, and that he alone was left to figure out what kind of hero he wanted to become without the surrogate father who had spent 2 years, however gruffly, trying to make sure he never had to learn that lesson alone. Bucky Barnes and Sam Wilson, the two men Steve Rogers trusted most by the end of his life, inherited a friendship neither of them expected, and neither of them particularly wanted at first. One carrying 70 years of stolen memory and Hydra programming, the other carrying the weight of a shield he wasn't sure he had the right to hold, and the uneasy, often very funny partnership they built afterward became its own quiet answer to a question this saga had been asking since a cave in Afghanistan. What do broken people owe each other once the mission is finally over? Nebula, Gamora's sister, spent this entire saga as one of its quietest tragedies, mutilated repeatedly by Thanos as a child for the crime of losing sparring matches he had engineered specifically to be unwinnable, replaced piece by piece with machinery until she barely recognized her own body, taught for decades that her sister's victories were proof of Nebula's own inadequacy rather than simple, arbitrary cruelty dressed up as discipline. She defected from Thanos long before Gamora's death, driven by a hatred that had curdled from decades of engineered inferiority, and spent years hunting her own father in a doomed, obsessive campaign for a revenge she never fully got to claim on her own terms. It was only in the final stretch of this saga, working alongside Tony and the surviving Guardians, that Nebula finally let go of the belief that had defined her entire existence, that love, as Thanos had taught it to her, was a competition with only one winner. She grieved her sister honestly, for the first time rather than resentfully, and in doing so became something Thanos, for all his careful cruelty, never once managed to make her, a person capable of choosing family rather than simply surviving it. Thor, having lost his father, his mother, his brother, his hammer, his home, his people, and very nearly his own sense of self, across 11 years of accumulated grief, made a choice at the end of this saga that surprised almost everyone who had watched him fight so hard to hold on to every version of the throne he was supposedly destined for. He gave the crown of the remaining Asgardian refugees to Valkyrie, a warrior who had earned it through her own long, complicated redemption, and left Earth entirely with the Guardians of the Galaxy, choosing a found family built from misfits over the bloodline and legacy that had defined every single decision of his life up until that point. It is, in its own way, the single clearest thesis statement this entire saga ever produces, spoken not in dialogue, but in action. Family, in this story, was never really about blood. It was about who chose to stay and who you chose to become once nobody was left to tell you who you were supposed to be. There is one more thread in this saga that the public version of the story kept hidden for years, and hiding it was the point, because the man at the center of it had built his entire double life around making sure it stayed hidden. Clint Barton was introduced to this saga as a SHIELD agent, armed with a bow and arrow, brainwashed by Loki's scepter within his first few minutes on screen, spending the Battle of New York fighting for the wrong side entirely before Natasha's intervention finally broke Loki's control over him. What almost nobody outside his own teammates realized was that Clint had spent the entire time before that moment building a life so ordinary and so deliberately separate from his work that it barely seemed to belong to the same man. A wife named Laura, 2 children, with a third on the way, a farmhouse kept entirely off SHIELD's official records at Natasha's insistence, the one person in his professional life he trusted enough to know it existed at all. That farmhouse only became visible to the audience during the fallout from Ultron, when the team, fractured and exhausted after Sokovia, retreated there to regroup, and Tony Stark, standing in Clint's kitchen watching this legendary marksman peel vegetables and referee an argument between his kids, was visibly and completely disarmed by it. It reframed everything about who Clint actually was. He was not simply the team's steady, reliable archer. He was a man who had spent years compartmentalizing an entire second existence so completely that his own closest allies had no idea it existed, protecting his family the only way he knew how, by making sure the danger of his work never once got close enough to touch them. The snap took that family from him in an instant, all of them, dust in the space of a single afternoon on a farm hundreds of miles from any battlefield, while Clint himself was left standing in a kitchen suddenly, unbearably empty. Grief, for most of the people in this saga, produced withdrawal, or obsession, or denial. For Clint, it produced violence. He became Ronin, a masked vigilante hunting and executing criminals across multiple continents, with a brutality that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with a man trying to punish a world that had taken the only thing he had ever actually wanted for himself. Natasha was the one who tracked him down, the one person who had known about his family from the very beginning, and she was the one who eventually convinced him to come back into the fold, rather than disappear entirely into the version of himself that violence was slowly turning him into. That history is what makes the fight the two of them had on Vormir so much heavier than it would otherwise be. Clint had already lost one family to a cause bigger than himself. Natasha, who had spent years quietly protecting the existence of that family from the rest of the world, was not about to let him lose himself too, and the desperate physical fight between them on that cliff was never really about who was stronger. It was about which of them had already decided their own life mattered less, and Natasha, whose entire adult life had been built on the belief that her ledger could never be fully balanced, won that argument the same way she had been quietly losing it to herself for years. When Clint returned home afterward and eventually got his family back through Bruce's snap, he carried Natasha's absence into every single day of the life she had just given back to him, a debt he understood, better than almost anyone else in this story, could never actually be repaid, only honored. Go back to that image from the very beginning of this account, a burned man kneeling in the dirt, saying 4 words for the second time in his life. The first time he said them, "I am Iron Man," they were a declaration of independence, a rich, damaged man refusing to hide behind his company's denials any longer, choosing, for the first time, to be seen exactly as he was. The second time he said them, dying, surrounded by the family he had spent 11 years building without ever quite admitting that's what it had become, they were something closer to a confession. This is who I turned out to be. Not the weapons dealer his father's company made him, not the paranoid genius who built Ultron out of fear. The man who finally, at the very end, chose to burn himself out entirely, rather than let the people he loved keep paying for a fear he had been carrying since a cave in Afghanistan. That is the actual shape of this saga, once you strip away the portals and the alien armies and the 6 shining stones. It is not a story about superheroes stopping villains. It is a story about what happens to people who are never given the time to heal before the next disaster arrives, and what they choose to become anyway, in spite of that, not because the wounds close, but because they decide, over and over, that the people standing next to them are worth bleeding for regardless. Every founding member of this team loses something the story never gives back. Tony loses his life. Natasha loses hers first, quietly, on a cliff nobody was watching. Steve loses an entire century, and then chooses, when he's finally given the chance to reclaim some of it, to spend his reward on something smaller and quieter than sainthood, an ordinary life, with an ordinary woman, dancing the dance he promised her 70 years too late. Thor loses everyone who ever told him who he was supposed to be, and has to build an entirely new answer from nothing. Bruce loses the war between his 2 selves only by finally admitting there was never actually 2 selves to begin with. Wanda loses more than any of them, and the story doesn't even pretend her ending is finished. This is why the format matters as much as the facts. A highlight reel of battles would tell you what the Avengers did. It would not tell you why 11 years and 20-some films later, people still return to this story, still feel something specific and real, when Tony says 4 words for the second time. The truth this saga keeps circling back to, chapter after chapter, loss after loss, is uncomfortable and simple at the same time. Being chosen by fate to save the world is not actually the hard part of this story. The hard part, the part that costs Natasha her life and Tony his, and nearly costs Thor his mind, is choosing again and again, without being asked and without being thanked, to stay. Consider, for a moment, how differently each of the founding 6 actually arrived at that choice. Tony was handed a fortune and a name, and spent years running from both before he ever chose, freely, to become someone worth the legacy. Steve was handed nothing but a good heart, in a body too small to carry it, and the serum only ever gave him the physical means to finally act on a conviction that had been there the entire time, waiting for a body strong enough to match it. Thor was handed a throne he had to lose completely, more than once, before he understood that ruling and belonging were never actually the same thing. Bruce was handed a curse he spent a decade treating as a life sentence before he finally, painstakingly, learned to treat it as simply one true part of a whole person. Natasha was handed a debt she never asked for and spent her entire adult life trying to pay down, one mission at a time, until the debt itself became the closest thing to an identity she ever let herself claim. And Clint was handed an ordinary life he built in secret, specifically because he understood, better than any of them, exactly how much the extraordinary one could cost. None of them arrived at the same starting point. None of them needed the same thing from each other. And that, more than any shared uniform or shared enemy, is the actual argument this saga keeps making, quietly, underneath every battle and every funeral. Family, the kind that actually holds under pressure, was never going to be built from people who were already alike. It was built from people willing to keep showing up for each other precisely because they weren't, learning slowly and at enormous personal cost. That difference was never the obstacle to belonging that every one of them, in their own private way, had once assumed it was. That is the story this account has been telling since a man in a cave decided a car battery and a stolen scrap of armor were worth building, if it meant one more chance to become someone worth the name he'd give himself. Not gods, not soldiers, not weapons. Just a handful of broken people who kept choosing each other anyway, long after choosing had stopped being easy, until the choosing itself was the only thing left standing when everything else had already been paid for. Thank you for joining Lords and Lions. We will see you next time.